Hey Chevra, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Gimel, Daf 103 of Masechta Ayruvin. Chevra, it's a very full page. You're gonna have to pay attention and halt kappa shtickle. Yeah, you gotta focus for this one. You gotta focus. There's some subtleties over here. We're going to continue on our Mishnayos, comparing things that are able to be done in the Beis HaMikdash versus things that are able to be done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And that includes tying a harp string. If you have a Levite who is playing on his harp and a string breaks, how do you go about fixing that? Removing warts from Korbans, right? Korbans can't have warts, so how do you remove them on Shabbos or Yom Tov? Probably Shabbos, I guess. Maybe Yom Tov too. Okay. And if you have a Korban who gets a cut on it, no, not a Korban, a Kohen who gets a cut on his finger. So, fixing that. Chevre, we're going to start on Daf Kuf Beis Amud Beis at the Mishnah, about 10 lines from the bottom. Kosher Nima B'Mikdash, Avalo B'Medina, in Batchile Kan V'Chan Osir. Oh, very nice. So, if you have a Levi, and the Levi has his harp, and a string broke on the harp, so you can tie the string, connect the two ends, put it in a knot, and good as new. You could do that in the Beis HaMikdash, Avalo B'Medina. You cannot do that outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, but if already before Shabbos the string was broken and you could have done it before Shabbos, well then even in the Beis HaMikdash you are going to be unable to tie this string together. Now says the Gemara, but we have a contradiction. Nimaskino shenifsika lo hayakosha ela onva. We have a brisa that says that if you have the string of a harp that broke, do not tie it. Ela onva. You could put it in a bow. Okay. So on the one hand, our Mishnah is saying that if you have this string from a harp, or really from any instrument that broke, you may tie it, but we have a brisa that's saying you may not tie it. Chevra, what do we do? Lo kash, it's no problem. Harabanan v'Rabbi Eliezer. Oh. Okay, that our Mishnah that says, so let's go weiter. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, whose opinion is that machshirei mitzvah dochenes haShabbos, that not just mitzvahs can be doches Shabbos, right? We learned this in Gemara Shabbos, in the Perek Rabbi Eliezer de Mila, right? That Rabbi Eliezer says that not only is bris milah doches Shabbos, but if you don't have a knife, you can even create coals so that you could then heat up metal in order to make a knife, right? It's not just the mitzvah itself that's docha Shabbos, but even any meta things that need to be done in preparation for the mitzvah are also docha Shabbos. So therefore, in application as applied to, or I guess in the context of a harp string, so that would mean not only is playing the harp going to be docha Shabbos, after all, we don't play musical instruments only because of a shvus midorabanan anyways, so that you don't come to fix it. So not only are you allowed to play the harp in the Beis HaMikdash, but in fact, if it breaks, you would even be able to fix it so that you can continue to play it. That is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And therefore, our Mishnah that says that you may fix the string is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. So Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar, Machshir mitzvah dochin is a Shabbos kosher, the Rabbanon, Damri ein dochin onva. And according to the rabbis who say that that Machshir mitzvah are not dochin, right? While the mitzvah can be docha Shabbos, and in this case, you're allowed to play the instrument on Shabbos, but nonetheless, if a string breaks, you will be unable to fix it. Okay, and that's in the brisa. And instead, they suggest just tie it in a bow, because a bow is a type of knot that you are allowed to tie on Shabbos. We learned the other day that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that even a bow is not allowed. We're actually going to get to that in a minute. But the Gemara asks, Rabbi Eliezer, if the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, afilu l'chatchila nami, well then, why does it say, right, the Mishnah says, vim batchila kan v'chan aser, that if the string was already broken before Shabbos, so then you wouldn't even be able to fix it in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, if this is Rabbi Eliezer doesn't care when the string is broken. The fact of the matter is, machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, so you should be allowed to fix the string regardless of when it broke. So ela lo kasha ha Rabbi Yehuda ba'Rabbanan. Okay, so rather say that the Mishnah isn't Rabbi Eliezer, the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. That Rabbi Yehuda says that a bow is really just a regular kind of knot. So there really is no distinction between, meaning in the Brisa where it says don't tie it in a knot, tie it in a bow. Rabbi Yehuda, as we learned the other day, says that a bow is really just a regular kind of knot. Now, if that's the case, tying in a bow isn't really going to make any difference. So Rabbi Yehuda is our Mishnah who says, look, if it breaks on Shabbos, then just tie it in a regular knot. And he's going to hold so the Gemara is going to actually explain what's the deal with Rabbi Yehuda. What does he hold vis-a-vis machshiri mitzvah? Fine. Rabbanan and the Brisas, the rabbis who say that machshiri mitzvah are not docha Shabbos, and therefore, if the string breaks, do not fix it. If you want, you could tie it in a bow. Rabbi Yehuda aliba deman. Now, where does Rabbi Yehuda's opinion lie vis-a-vis machshiri mitzvah? I aliba de Rabbi Eliezer ka'amar afilu l'chatchila nami. Now, the same question we asked against Rabbi Eliezer, that if Rabbi Yehuda is in line with Rabbi Eliezer, i.e. that machshiri mitzvah docha Shabbos, well then, you should be able to fix this string even if it was already broken before Shabbos. After all, machshiri mitzvah override Shabbos, right? And therefore, in order to play the musical instrument, you have to have a functional harp, and therefore you're allowed to fix a harp string that broke. Well, then even if it broke before Shabbos, you should be able to fix it. So, Ella lo kasha harib Shimon harabanan. Okay, so rather, let's start over. The Mishnah is the rabbis, and the Brisa, which says that you're not allowed to tie it, instead you put it in a bow, that is Rib Shimon. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Ben Levi shenifska lo nima bechinur. If you have a Levite whose harp broke, lost a string, so kosher, so you can tie it. That's the opinion of the Tanakama. It's the opinion of the Chachamim, that if you have a harp string that broke, so you can fix it. Rib Shimon Omer onva. Rib Shimon says no, you cannot fix it. Rather tie it in a bow because it doesn't count as a knot. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, af he eina mashmas esakol. He says, look, Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, who are we kidding? Tying a string is not going to make a very good sound, right? Imagine you have a guitar string and it broke, and instead of replacing the string, you just tied it in a knot. You tied together the two ends in a knot. It's not going to make a very good sound. So ela mishalshel milamata v'korech milamayla, or mishalshel milamayla v'korech milamata. Essentially, it says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, replace the string, right? I mean, you can put, right, what the Gemara is explaining is that, if you've ever strung a guitar, so you kind of slip the string through, and then from the peg, you kind of wind it and tighten it. That's essentially what Reb Shimon ben Elazar is describing, that completely replace the string, put it in, wind up the knobs, and completely replace it. So going back to our Mishnah and this Brisa, so our Mishnah says that you're allowed to replace the string. That is the opinion of the rabbis, because they say that machshir and mitzvah are going to be docha Shabbos, like Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore you can replace it. However, if you were able to have done it before Shabbos, well then we say you missed your chance, right? Meaning if it was already broken before Shabbos and you ignored it, well then you're going to be unable to fix it on Shabbos. However, if it broke on Shabbos, they would say machshir mitzvah docha is Shabbos, and therefore you could tie up the string in a regular knot. The Brisa, which says no, you cannot use a regular knot. Rather, if you want, you can use a bow. That is Reb Shimon's opinion. Fine, because he says the machshir mitzvah would not be docha Shabbos. Weiter. Or you could say that both opinions are the rabbi's opinion. The Mishnah that says that you can tie the string, and the Brisa that says you can only use a bow, they're both the rabbis. It depends where it broke. If the string broke in the middle, well then you need a starker knot, a stronger knot. So therefore you can use a regular knot. But if the string broke closer to one of the ends, well then a bow will suffice, and that's what the Brisa is talking about. Or if you want, I will say, or if you want, I will say that no, both the Mishnah and the Brisa are talking about where the string broke in the middle. Mar savar gazunan, mar savar lo gazunan. And going back to what we said in the previous Ukimto, which is that one of them is the rabbis and one of them is Reb Shimon. So we're going back to that, however, in a different way. Initially, we wanted to say that the Mishnah was the rabbi's opinion because they say Machshir mitzvah are docha Shabbos, and the Brisa was Reb Shimon who says Machshir mitzvah are not docha Shabbos, therefore use a bow. Here we're revisiting that distinction between Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, but we're saying it's for different reasons. We're saying that both of them agree, both Reb Shimon and the Rabbanon agree that Machshir mitzvah are docha Shabbos. Now, and Me'ikra Adin, right? So, and they're both talking about where the string broke in the middle of the string. So, technically speaking, both Reb Shimon and the Chacham agree, Machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, you should be able to tie the string in a knot in the middle of the string. However, so the Chacham just say that, right, straight out, and they say, great, so tie it in a knot. And they're going to be the authors of our Mishnah. However, Reb Shimon says, even though Me'ikra Adin, you could tie it in a knot in the middle of the string. However, Gazrinan, right, we make a gezerah that, well, since if it would break at the end of the string, you wouldn't tie it in a knot, you would tie it in a bow. So therefore, Reb Shimon wants to say, even if it breaks in the middle of the string, still we want you to tie it in a bow, atu, right, because of the case when it breaks at the end where you would tie it in a bow. So that is the distinction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, the Mishnah being the Chachamim, the Brisa being Reb Shimon. Okay, Chevin, now we're up to a new Mishnah. Alright, things get a little bit subtle over here, so you gotta really focus. So this Mishnah talks about removing a wart from a animal, right? So if you have an animal that you want to offer as a korban, the pasuk says that you're not allowed to have warts on it. So if you have a wart and it's Shabbos and you're in the Beis HaMikdash and you want to remove the wart, so can you? So it says the Mishnah, Chotchin yabeles b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So you can remove a wart from an animal if it's in the Beis HaMikdash, avalo b'medina, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Vim bichli kan v'chan asur. But you're not allowed to use a kli. You can't use like a knife or something. You gotta use your hands, or maybe we're gonna see on Amud Beis, maybe you could bite it off. Sounds a shtickle gross. Chevre, let's go weiter in the Gemara. But we have a contradiction. That if you have a Korban Pesach and it's Erev Pesach and I guess it's Shabbos, so if you bring the Korban, if you carry the sheep from in Rosh Hashanah, or bringing it from outside of Tchum Shabbos, or cutting off any warts that it might have, are not doche Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer Omer dochen. Rabbi Eliezer says that it is doche Shabbos, that it can override Shabbos. So the question is that our Mishnah says chotchin yabeles b'mikdash avalo b'medina, right? Our Mishnah says that you'd be allowed to cut off warts from a korban. Yet, in the context of the Korban Pesach, the Tanna Kama is saying that you're not allowed to remove the warts. So, can I or can't I? So, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. So here, we have a machlokas between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Chad Omar, one of them says, Ha v'ha bilacha. Okay, so one opinion, and we don't know who it is, but one opinion is that both Mishnayos are talking about moist, plump, geschmacka warts. V'lo kasha, and there's no problem. Kan biyad, kan b'chli. That the Mishnah, which says that you're allowed to remove the wart, it's talking about biyad, removing it, use your fingers, your nails, remove the wart. Very beautiful. Kan b'chli, the Mishnah in Psachim, which says that you're not allowed to remove the wart, well, that is using a kli, using an implement, like a knife or something. That's why you're not allowed to do it. Okay, fine. So far, so good. V'chad Omer ha biyad. And the other opinion is that both Mishnayos are talking about using your hand, not using a kli, using your hand. Okay. v'lo kasha, and it's no problem. Hablacha habiyavesha. The distinction is that our Mishnah, which says that you're allowed to remove the wart, is talking about a dry wart. Okay, and the Mishnah in Psachim, which says that you're not allowed to remove the wart, is talking about a moist wart. Okay, fine, but both of them are talking about biyad. Okay, very good. Now, Chevre, I'm going to refer, now since we don't have names over here, right, we have Rabbi Lazar and we have Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, but we don't know who says which. So, I'm going to refer to the first opinion that we saw as the opinion that says that both Mishnayos are talking about bilach, when it's moist. And then the second opinion, which is that both Mishnayos are talking about biyad, that you're using your hand. Okay? Now, Ulmanda Amar ha biyad v'ha bichli. So according to the Manda Amar, i.e. the first opinion, that says that both Mishnayos are talking about where the wart is moist, the distinction being our Mishnah is talking about biyad, and the Mishnah in Psachim is talking about bichli. So my time alo Amar ha belacha ha biyavesha. How come he didn't agree with his dissenting opinion, which is both Mishnayos are talking about biyad, and the distinction being our Mishnah is dry and the Mishnah in Psachim is moist? So Amalach, well, because because the first opinion, which is that both of them are moist, well, he'll say Yevesha afilu bichli na mishari my time efrucha iparcha. Well, because he'll say that, well, the only time that things matter is when we're talking about a moist wart, right? That both Mishnayos are talking about where it's moist. Our Mishnah is talking about biyad. The Mishnah in Psachim is talking about bichli. However, if we're talking about a dried out wart, well, then you can remove it however you want, whether it's biyad, whether it's bichli. If it's dried out, you can remove it. Right? Now, the other Manda Amar, who says that both Mishnayos are talking about biyad, but the distinction is whether it's moist or whether it's dry, he'll say that you're not allowed to remove a dried out wart with a kli. So therefore, the distinction being a dried out wart, removing it with a kli, the Manda Amar, the first Manda Amar, who says that both Mishnayos are talking about a moist wart, so he'll say a dry wart you can remove however you want, even with a kli. The second Manda Amar, who says that both Mishnayos are talking about biyad, but the distinction is whether it's bichli, whether it's dry or moist, he'll say that a dry wart can only be removed biyad, but not with a kli. So therefore, that is why the first opinion says he cannot agree with the second opinion. Okay, very beautiful. Now, according to the Manda Amar, who says that both Mishnayos are talking about biyad, when you remove the wart with your hand, and the distinction between the two Mishnayos is that our Mishnah is talking about a dried out wart, the other Mishnah is talking about a moist wart. My time lo Amar ha biyad ha bichli. How come he doesn't agree with the first Manda Amar, who says that the Mishnah in Ayruvin is talking about biyad and the Mishnah in Psachim is talking about bichli? Well, Amar lach, because he'll say to you, bichli hatnan in bichli kan v'chan aser. Well, the second opinion, the one who says that the distinction is moist versus dry, he'll say, I don't need for there to be a distinction between a kli and not a kli, i.e. for the Mishnah in Psachim to tell us that you're not allowed to remove the wart with a kli. I already know that from the Mishnah in Ayruvin, right? Our Mishnah said, Ve'im b'chli kan v'chan aser, that if you're using a kli, like a knife, you would be unable to remove this wart, whether in the Mikdash or in the Medina. So we know already that you're not allowed to remove a wart with a kli. I don't need the Mishnah in Psachim to teach me that. The Idach, and the other opinion, which says that the Mishnah in Psachim is dafka talking about using a knife, so the first opinion, the one that says that the distinction is our Mishnah is talking about biyad, the Mishnah in Psachim is talking about a kli, he'll argue that the Mishnah in Psachim needs to teach us about a kli, specifically to teach us that Rabbi Eliezer argues and says that you would be able to remove the wart even with a kli, which is an Issur D'Oraisa. The Idach, and the opinion that says that the Mishnah in Psachim is talking about a moist wart. Dumya de'arkiveu the hakavaso v'avaso mechutz l'tchum katane d'Rabbanan. So, however, the dried out wart, the moist wart opinion, as opposed, right, the opinion who says that the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about a moist wart, but removing it biyad. So he's going to argue that, well, if you look at the other things in that Mishnah, they're all derabanan things, such as schlepping an animal in Rishus Harabim. As we learned in Masechta Shabbos, achai noseas atzmo, something that's alive carries itself, so it would really only be asur midirabanan. And in terms of taking the animal from outside of the Tchum Shabbos, Tchum and Dirabanan as well. So therefore, we would need that removing a wart be Midirabanan as well. And therefore, if you're saying that the wart removal is talking about a Kli, well, that would be Asur Midoraisa. But we need Asur Midirabanan. So therefore, it would have to be removing it with your hand, and it's talking about where it's moist and plump. So, V'idach, but the opinion that says that the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about removing the wart with a knife, Harkivo delo kreb nasan. So he'll say, actually, all those things in the Mishnah in Pesachim are deoraisas, right? Schlepping the animal for Amos in Rishus Harabim is actually also midoraisa. What about a chai noseas atzma? What about the fact that something that's alive carries itself? Well, delo kreb nasan. This Mishnah is not like Reb Nasan, the Amar who said in Masechta Shabbos, that something that's alive carries itself. So in this case, he doesn't hold like Reb Nasan. He doesn't hold a chai noseas atzmo, and therefore it's mamish could be an isur d'oraisa to carry this animal for Amos and Rishus Harabim. Have also mechutz l'tchum. And what about bringing it from outside of the Tchum Shabbos? Rabbi Akiva damar tchum d'oraisa. Well, he holds like Rabbi Akiva, who says that tchumen are mid'oraisa, and therefore also removing the wart would be with the kli, and it's going to be an isur d'oraisa. Chaver, you got that? So basically, we have two opinions there. One of them is Rabbi Elazar, one of them is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. We don't know who says which. One of them says that both Mishnayos are talking about a moist wart, and the distinction is whether, our Mishnah is talking about biyad and the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about bikli. And the other way to understand it is that both Mishnahs are talking about removing this wart with your hand. The difference would be that our Mishnah is talking about a dried out wart. The Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about a plump, moist, geschmacka wart. Chaver, let's go weiter. Masav Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef asks a kasha against the opinion who says that that in Pesachim it's talking about removing the wart with a knife. So Masav Rav Yosef asks the kasha, Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says regarding that Mishnah in Pesachim, Kal v'chomer. I'll tell you a kal v'chomer how you know that you can remove the wart. Well, umashchita she mishum melacha doches Shabbos. If shecht in the Korban Pesach, which is mamish a melacha, one of the avos melachos, shochet, it's nonetheless docha Shabbos. Well, then these things, removing warts, taking it from outside of the Tchum Shabbos, carrying it al rames, shemishum shvus, which are only asur midirabanan, einu din sheidachu es Shabbos, then certainly they should be docha Shabbos. So we see that Rabbi Eliezer says that Mishnah is dafka talking about removing warts in a way that would be asur midirabanan, i.e. biyad. So therefore, Ela Amar Rav Yosef, so rather, says Rav Yosef, Ha v'ha biyad. Both Mishnayos are talking about removing the warts with your hand, and also both of them are talking about where they're lach, where they're moist and plump and gishmak. V'shvuz demikdash b'mikdash itiru, shvuz demikdash b'medina lo itiru. And the distinction is about, can you do a shvuz demikdash b'medina? Meaning, here you're talking of, so there's a new piece to this, which is that all these preparations of the Korban Pesach are happening in your house, right? You take the Korban Pesach, you bring it to your house, you check it beforehand, and then you bring it to the Beis HaMikdash to shecht it. So therefore, all these things, all these preparations for this Korban Pesach are happening outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So our Mishnah, so both Mishnahs are talking about warts that are lach, and both of them are talking about removing it biyad, which is a shvus. However, our Mishnah is talking about in the Beis HaMikdash itself, and that's why it's permitted. The Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about in your house, which is, it's Shvus de Mikdash, it's a Shvus that's related to Kodsh, in the context of Kodshim, of your Korban Pesach, but it's outside of the base of Mikdash. Therefore, it's not allowed. That is the distinction that Rav Yosef wants to make. Yosef Abaye v'kamila shmaita. So Abaye was sitting, and he was saying this teaching of Rav Yosef about the distinction between these two Mishnayos being about Shvus de Mikdash, b'Medina versus b'Mikdash. So Eisvi Rav Safra Abaye. So Rav Safra asks a kasha against Abaye. Hayukori b'Sefer al Iskopa. If you have a fellow, we learned this the other day, Lamaise. If you have a fellow, and he's reading from a Megillah on an Iskopa, and the assumption for now is that the Iskopa is Rishus HaYachid. V'niskagala Sefer Miyado, and the Megillah rolled out of his hands into the Rishus HaRabim. So now he's sitting in Rishus HaYachid, he's still holding on to his Megillah, but the other end is in Rishus HaRabim. So, Gololo Etzla. So he can nonetheless roll it back to where he is. But what about over here? The Shvus de Mikdash b'Medina, that this is a Shvus regarding a Mikdash. What's the Mikdash over here? A Sefer. A Sefer is holy, and therefore it's a Shvus in the context of something holy, the Mikdash, b'Medina, and it's outside of the base of Mikdash. And we don't, nonetheless, we waive this Shvus. What's the Shvus? About making a Gezerah that maybe it'll fall into the Rishus HaRabim, and it'll bring it back into the Iskopa, which is a Rishus HaYachid. V'lo ukimna zeu. So we see that here's an example of Shvus de Mikdash b'Medina, right? A Shvus, the Shvus being that we should make a Gezerah that if the Megillah falls out of his hands into Rishus HaRabim, then maybe he'll bring it back to where he is in the Rishus HaYachid. So there's the Gezerah, yet we're saying he could roll it back. So we're saying that this Shvus, the Mikdash, which is in the context of something holy, in the context of this Megillah, and it's b'Medina, it's outside of the base of Mikdash, and yet we're saying, don't worry about the Shvus, you could still roll it back to where you are in the Rishus HaYachid. So Abaye says, what do you mean? V'lo kimna, didn't I say that it's talking about the Iskopa Carmelis, that the Iskopa is not a Rishus HaYachid, it's just a Carmelis, Rishus HaRabim overes lefanel, and it's a Rishus HaRabim in front of it. The Kavan the Igado b'Yado, that since he's still holding it on one end, afilu Shvus nami leka, it's not even a Shvus, because over there, right, it's talking about a Rishus HaRabim and a Carmelis, which, which in and of itself is only midrabanan anyways, and right, and therefore, since it itself is only midrabanan, there's no need to make a gezerah that maybe it'll fall into that place, and then you come to violate something midrabanan. That was not necessary. Okay. Eisvei. But then Rav Safra asks another kasha. In the context of a Korban Pesach, mishalshlin as a Pesach the soner im chashecha, that you can lower the Korban Pesach into the oven as it's mamish getting dark. Now, we had learned in Masechta Shabbos that it would have to be cooked before Shabbos begins. You have to put the food on the fire with enough time that it can be cooked before Shabbos begins. Over here we're saying that the Korban Pesach you can mamish put into the oven as Shabbos begins. But over here there's a Shvus the Mikdash being the Korban Pesach, which is Kadosh, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, right? Everyone cooks the Korban Pesach in their own house. And we don't make that Shvus, we don't make that Gezerah of maybe you're gonna be chot b'gechalim, maybe you're gonna stoke the coals. So here's an example of Shvus to Mikdash, right? Here's an example of the context of Mikdash, of a Korban Pesach, and it's b'Medina, it's outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's in your own home, and there is a Gezerah in general, which is you can't cook things on Shabbos or put things into the fire right before Shabbos because we're concerned that you might stoke the coals, and yet we're saying that don't worry about it. You could put the Korban Pesach onto the fire right before Shabbos, and we're not making it right Shvus b'Mikdash, b'Medina. So Ishtik, Abaye did not have an answer to Rav Safra's question. Kiyosu the Kamid of Yosef, when Abaye then came to Rav Yosef eventually, Omerle, he said to Rav Yosef, Hachi Omerle Rav Safra, this is what Rav Safra said to me. I was telling him what you were saying about the Shvus, the Mikdash, b'Mikdash versus b'Medina, and he asked me this question about the Korban Pesach. So Amarle, So Rav Yosef said to Abaye, "My time alo tishanile, why didn't you answer him the following? B'nei Chabura's reason that the Chevre who's organizing the Korban Pesach, there's reason. They're very makpid. They're very on top of things, and therefore they're certainly not going to be stoking the coals." Abaye were fastidious. So Abaye responded, and so how come Abaye didn't say that to Rav Safra? Because Kohanim's reason hein amrinon, Bnei Chabura's reason hein lo amrinon. Because while we'll say that the Kohanim are his reason, that the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash, they really know the halachas very well, and therefore they won't be chot b'chacham, they won't stoke the coals. But just anybody, who makes the Korban Pesach? We all make a Korban Pesach, regular people. And for the regular people might not know all the halachas, they might end up stoking the coals. Therefore, Abaye didn't feel comfortable saying that the reason why you can put the Korban Pesach into the fire right as Shabbos begins is because he wasn't convinced that everyone is so makpid, everyone is so fastidious, and that they will, and knowledgeable in the halachas, that they won't be stoking the coals. And therefore, he didn't really have a way to answer Rav Safra, because it did seem like a situation of Shvus de Mikdash B'Medina, and we seem to be waiving it. Rava Omar, Rava said, Rabbi Eliezer, says Rava, that our Mishnah, which says that you could remove the warts, Lamai says Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer, who says, as we saw earlier, the Machshir Mitzvah Docha Shabbos, and therefore, just like offering a Korban is Docha Shabbos, so removing its warts are also Docha Shabbos. What about the fact that the Mishnah says that in Bechli kan v'chan aser? What about the fact that our Mishnah says that you're not allowed to use a Kli? If it was Rabbi Eliezer, he says Machshir Mitzvah Docha Shabbos, so remove the wart however the heck you want. So However, Rabbi Eliezer nonetheless admits that you would make as many changes as possible. So even though, yes, Machshir Mitzvah or Docha Shabbos, and you would theoretically be able to remove this wart with a knife. However, if you can just remove the wart with your hands, then we'd prefer that you do it that way, because no need to get carried away needlessly. Maihi, and how do I know that I can prove to you that Rabbi Eliezer would say that even though Machshir Mitzvah or Docha Shabbos, if you can make a shinoi, you should. So Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Kohen should also bo yabeles. So if you have a Kohen and he has a wart, a Kohen also is not allowed to have a wart, just like his animals can't have a wart for the Korbanis. So Chavero chotchelo b'shinav. You hear that, Chaver? So he gets his friend to bite off his wart. How do you guys feel about that? A little bit uneasy? I agree. Uncle Panim. So you have a Kohen, and he has a wart. So he gets his friend to bite it off for him. Now, there are two differences over here. One is that he's not allowed to do it himself. And two is that his friend who's doing it for him, he's not just removing it with his hand, he's taka biting it. So those are some pretty significant shinois. So b'shinav in b'chlilo. So we say Dafka has to bite it off. He can't use. So he has to bite it off. He can't use a kli. Sorry, the distinction between using his mouth versus using a kli. Chaveru in iulo, and he's got to get his friend to do it, but he would be unable to remove this wart himself. So money, and who is the author of this brisa? Ilim Rabbanon. So if you say it's the rabbis, now this is referring back to a machlokas that we had in Masechta Shabbos and Daf Tzadi Daled, which is about removing fingernails on Shabbos. That regarding removing your own fingernails, everyone agrees that you're not allowed to use a kli. However, if you want to use your fingers to remove your fingernails, or if you want to bite your fingernails, so then Rabbi Eliezer says you're going to be chayav korban chatos, whereas the Chacham say it's pater aval aser. But both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham would agree that if your friend does it for you, if your friend bites your fingernails, well then it would be pater aval aser. So now, if we're saying that this brisa is the rabbis, uva mikdash, and it's in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore ain't shvus b'mikdash, and therefore it's allowed as long as it's midir rabbanon. So kevin da amir rabbanon be'alma mishum shvus. Well, since the rabbi said, look, in general, if you bite your fingernails, so it'll only be a shvus, will only be midrabanan. So hacha malihu mali chaveru. Well, then here in the Beis Hamikdash, where we say ein shvus b'mikdash, why do I need my friend to bite off my wart for me? I could bite off my own wart, or right? Yeah. So I don't, so I'm missing that piece, right? If it's the rabbi's opinion, why would I need my friend to bite off my wart? Biting off my own wart is only midrabanan and ain't shvus b'mikdash. So elalav Rabbi Eliezer. Rather, it must be that this brayso says Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar ba'alma chayiv chatos, who says that in general you would be chayiv a korban chatos, and over here we're saying that the reason why you're allowed to bite off the wart on Shabbos is because machshir mitzvah dochnes Shabbos, right? That in order for him to be able to do avoda, this wart must be removed. So therefore his friend can bite it off for him. And here, even though it's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is a machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, and therefore I can, theoretically remove it with a knife, right? It's docha Shabbos. I don't need my friend to bite it off for me. But nonetheless, even though, yes, theoretically, you'd be able to remove this wart with a knife because machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, still Rabbi Eliezer is suggesting get your friend to bite it off for you because as many shinuis as we can are preferable. The Gemara says, lo, not true. Lo olam rabbanon. Really, the author of this brisa is the rabbis. Okay, but if it's the rabbis, then why is his friend biting off his wart? He can bite off his own wart. So vi also b'kreiso achinami. Well, if the wart was on his stomach and he can just bite it off, or probably use his fingers either, then sure, let him bite off his own wart. But hachab mayaskinan kigon she'osolo begabo uvatzili yadav. Here it's talking about where the wart was on his back or on his elbows, the iu lomatzi shakile, that he's unable to remove it. Because he's unable to remove it himself, he's got to get his friend to bite it off. Okay, but one second, if that's really true that it's the rabbis, nishkale niele biyat, will let his friend remove it with his hand. How come he has to bite it? The tifshot, and if we say that he can remove it with his hand, well then you'll answer, the Rabbi Lazar, the Amr Rabbi Lazar, machlokas biyad, ava b'chli devya kol chayev. Now Rabbi Lazar explained in the machlokas between the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer regarding biting your fingernails, that the machlokas is davka with biyad, removing it biyad, that the Chacham say that it's potter, that you're potter, and Rabbi Eliezer says that you're chayiv, but if it's with a kli, everyone says that you're going to be chayiv. Now, if the Rabbanan would just say, if this brisa is the rabbis, well, let them just say that let his friend use his hand, and then we'll see that that it's like Rabbi Lazar's explanation of the machlokas, that the Chacham say that if you remove the wart, your fingernails, but in this case the wart biyad, well then it's already potter, and it's going to be a shvus. So if the rabbis would just say over here, let his friend remove the wart with your hands, so then I would see, with his hands, and I would see that it's like Rabbi Lazar, Masech the Shabbos, who says that when it comes to removing a wart biyad, the Chacham say that it's already a shvus, and therefore, that's why in the Mikdash it's permitted. Right? But by saying that he bites it off, then you kind of miss the opportunity to say that it's like Rabbi Lazar, who says that the Chacham say that already removing it with your hand would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Well, if that's the case, that you're trying to prove how it is not the rabbis, well, what do you want to say? That it's Rabbi Eliezer? The Rabbi Eliezer nami, lishkale niele biyad. Well, according to Rabbi Eliezer, also, let him remove it with his hand. Meaning, because even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says, Ein shvus b'mikdash, who says, machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, and therefore, really, you can even remove this wart with a kli. But we want to make some kind of shinoi nonetheless. So let him just, what we already have his friend removing his wart for him, which even Rabbi Eliezer agrees would only be an Isser Midur Abanon. Well then, at that point, stop there. How come we need him to also bite it off? So, Iyamad Bishlam Rabbi Eliezer Hanu Degazer Yad Atu Kli. Well, I understand if you say that it's Rabbi Eliezer, that we're saying even though technically it should be enough to just use your hand, but we say, let's make as far of a shinoi as we can and say, not just you're removing, your friend shouldn't remove the wart with his hand, because maybe if he uses the hand, then maybe you'll make a kli, and then you won't have a shinoi anymore. You won't have any kind of difference. And Rabbi Eliezer wants there to be some kind of a difference. But if you say that, but Rabbi Eliezer says don't stop over there. Also, you should bite it off, because kama de'efshel shanuyim shaninan, like Rava wants to say. Ella. If you say it's the rabbis, let him just remove it, as we said before. Let him remove it with the hand. His friend doesn't have to bite it off, because if he removes it with his hand, say it's like Rabbi Elazar, that the Chacham say that removing your fingernails with your hand is already a shvus, and according to the rabbis, all that you need is a shvus, right? All you need is to be derabanan, and ain't shvus b'mikdash. So once already your friend is removing it with his hand, right? So that's already midrabanan, and ain't shvus b'mikdash, and that's enough. You don't need to do anything more. You don't need him to bite it off. But I understand dafka if it's Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer says, look, meikar adin machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos, and you can even remove it b'chli. But we want to make as many shinois as you can, and therefore, you know what? Have your friend do it, and not only have your friend do it with his hand, have him bite it off, so he can get as far away as possible. And that's Rava's opinion, that our Mishnah is who says that you're removing this wart is Rabbi Eliezer. So then why is he saying dafka do it biyad and not bechli? It's because we want to make as many shinuis as we can. New Mishnah. Kohen shalaka be'etzba'o. If you have a kohen and he cuts himself on his finger. Very nice. Korech aleh gemi. So you can wrap a reed around it. Okay? And that reed will be helpful in healing the finger. So now, in general, you don't do things that are healing on Shabbos, but in the Beis HaMikdash, since it's only a Shavuos, you're allowed to do it. Ba'mikdash avalo ba'medina. You can use this reed in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. From the hotzi dam, kan v'chan aser. But if you're intending to remove blood from the finger, which is epis chabura, and Rashi actually says something very interesting. He gives two reasons why. Right? It says kan v'chan aser. Even in the Beis HaMikdash, it's going to be aser. One reason is she'ein zet tzorech avoda. I love this distinction, that because this is not a need of the avoda. Meaning, when we say ein shvus b'mikdash, that there's no concept of these derabanans in the Beis HaMikdash, doesn't just mean it's a free-for-all in the Beis HaMikdash that you can do any derabanans you want. It means in the context of the Kohanim doing their avoda in the Beis HaMikdash, if there's an issur derabanan, don't worry about it. But if you're just intending to remove blood from your wound, which is a chabura, well, if you're just intending, well, he says two things. Right? He says, first of all, it's a chabura, which is an issur d'oraisa, and therefore the oraisas aren't, and that's the second thing he says. Look, he says it's a chabura, which is d'oraisa anyway, so therefore it's not going to be docha Shabbos in the Mikdash. But the first thing he says is that even if it was a d'rabanan, it's not l'tzorech avoda. It's not in the context of avoda, and therefore it wouldn't fall under the category of ein shvus b'mikdash anyways. Okay. So Amar Yehuda Brei Reb Chia, Loshanu ela gemi. So it says of Yehuda Brei Reb Chia that when the Mishnah says that you're allowed, that if a kohen has a cut on his finger, he's allowed to wrap a reed around it. Well, that's exactly what it means. He's allowed to wrap a reed around it. Aval siltzul kain aviyitur begadim. But if you would use some kind of like belt, some kind of nice belt, and wrap that around the wound instead of a reed, that would be a problem of yisur begadim, of having too many garments, right? A kohen has a specific amount of garments. Kohen Hedjot has 4 garments. A kohen gadol has 8 garments. So you can't have more, you can't have less. And Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chia is saying is that if you would use a tziltzul cotton, if you would use this small belt, well, that would be a problem of adding on an extra garment. Interesting. Therefore, stick to the reed. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, says Rabbi Yochanan, Lo amru yisur begadim ela b'makom begadim. Says Rabbi Yochanan, look, this idea of adding on garments is only in a place where you have garments. There's no kohen garments that go on your fingers, and therefore taking a belt and putting it on your finger is not going to be a violation of adding garments. As long as this garment, this belt, or whatever it might be that you're adding, is not in a place where you have garments, so then it won't, it'll be okay. But Rabbi Yochanan, even if it's not a problem of adding garments, what about the fact that it's going to make a chatzitza? As we learned the other day, in the context of a bandage of a kohen, that you can't have something interfering between your hand and whatever you're holding in the Beis Hamikdash. I.e., you can't have any chatzitzas when you can't have anything on your hands when you're doing the avoda. And therefore, even if this thing that you're putting on your hand, Rabbi Yochanan would say, is no problem with Yisur Begadim because there's no Begadim on your hands. But what about the fact that it's a chatzitza? So Bismol. The Gemara answers, well, you could say it's talking about his left hand, and he's not doing avoda with his left hand. He's doing avoda with his right hand. Inami biyamin. Or you could say, you know what? It is talking about his right hand. Well, if it's his right hand, why is there no problem with chatzitza? V'shelo b'makom avoda. Fine, because it's maybe the back of his hand. So it's a part where it's not going to make a chatzitza. Fine. Now, ufliga de Rava. Now, this, which Rabbi Yochanan says, that if you put this belt on your hand, there's no issues at all about adding begadim, because there are no garments that go on your hand. That argues on Rava. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Chizda. He says, Rava in the name of Rav Chizda, b'makom begadim afilu nima achas chotzetzes. That in a place where you normally have begadim, let's say, I don't know, your back or something, right? So then, even a thread is going to be a chatzitza, right? If you have if you have a thread between your flesh and the clothes, the garments of the kohanim, well, then that will be a chatzitza. Even the smallest thing would be a chatzitza if it's in a place where you generally are wearing garments. Shelo b'makom begadim, but if it's in a place where there are no priestly garments, such as on your hand, shalosh al shalosh chotzitzos pachos mishalosh al shalosh einan chotzitzos. Well, if the garment that we're speaking of that you're adding to your hand is 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, well then it will be a chatzitza, i.e. it will be a violation of yisur begadim, of adding on garments. But if it's less than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, well then there won't be any problem of adding garments. So ad Rabbi Yochanan vadai pliga. So Rava Amar Rav Chizda certainly argues in Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said that in a place where there's no garments, there is there's no concept of adding of yisur begadim. Now, however, Rava said in the name of Rav Chizda that, well, that's only true if it's less than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths. If it's larger than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, it would be yisur begadim. So Rava Amar Rav Chizda is certainly arguing on Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Yehuda Breder B'chia minema pliga. Does he necessarily argue on Rav Yehuda Breder B'chia? So Rav Yehuda Breder B'chia said that if you have this belt and you wrap it around your finger, it would be yisur begadim. Now, that belt is less than 3 etzbaos. So on the one hand, it sounds like that would be different than Rava Amar Rav Chizda, who says if it's less than 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos, it would not be yisur begadim. But on the other hand, shiny tziltzul ka'in d'chashiv. You could say that really Rabbi Yehuda Breder B'chia and Rava Amar Rav Chizda agree that as a rule, if a garment is less than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, it would not be yisur begadim. But this garment is different because it's particularly fancy, it's particularly significant, important. So therefore, even though it's smaller than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, it would still be a yisur begadim, extra garments, and therefore you can argue that Rabbi Yehuda Breder B'chia and Rava Amar Rav Chizda agree. Now, a slightly different way to understand this machlokas, Lishna Achrina, Amrila, they said things a little differently. Amar Rav Yehuda Breder B'chia lo shanu ela gemia val tziltzul katan chotzitz. Okay, nothing changed there, right? That Rabbi Yehuda Breder B'chia says that a Kohen is allowed to wrap a reed around his fingers, but not this fancy belt. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, this is slightly different. Says Rabbi Yochanan, lo amru chatzitza b'pachos mishalosh al shalosh ela b'makom begadim. When you have something that's less than 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos, that's only going to be a chatzitza in a place where there is clothing, right? Where you have priestly garments. Aval shelo b'makom begadim, but in a place where there are no priestly garments, such as on your finger, shalosh al shalosh chotzitzot, it would have to be 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos, pachos mishalosh ein chotzitzos. But if it's less than 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos, it would not be yisur begadim on your finger. Fine. V'hanu de Rava Amar Rav Chizda, and this is just like Rava Amar Rav Chizda. Okay, very good. Who says that same exact thing? Mamish, same exact thing as Rabbi Yochanan. So lema pliga to Rav Yehuda Breder B'chia. So let's say that maybe this argues on Rabbi Yehuda Breder B'chia, who says that this belt around your finger would be yisur begadim. but Rava Amar of Chizda says that Yisur Begadim is only if it's larger than 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos. So Shiny Tziltzul Ka'in the Chashiv. That you can argue, no, that really Reb Yehuda B'Rei Reb Chia and Rava Amar of Chizda would agree, and that as a principle it would have to be 3 etzbaos by 3 etzbaos. However, they would agree that this small belt would be Yisur Begadim since it's significant. So you can argue that Reb Yehuda B'Rei Reb Chia and Rava Amar of Chizda would agree there, but certainly Reb Yochanan and Reb Yehuda B'Rei Reb Chia are arguing because that's the machlokas between them. Reb Yochanan, Adashminon Gemi Lishmainon Tziltzul Ka'in. Now, according to Reb Yochanan, if he says that you can even tie your wound on your finger, your cut, with a Tziltzul Ka'in, with this small belt, well then, why don't you say that, why is the Mishnah talking about reeds? Why don't you say that they can use this small belt? So, Milsa Agav Orche Kamashman Tegemi Masi. Well, because the Mishnah wanted to teach us another sort of secondary thing, which is that a reed has healing qualities to it, and that's why the Mishnah Dafka mentioned reed, even though this small belt you could also theoretically wrap around your finger, according to Rabbi Yochanan. That was Daf Kuf Gimel of Masechta Ayruvin. There was a lot on this page, a lot of some very subtle things over here, things you really had to somehow wrap your brain around. Although I'll tell you the truth, I was questioning yesterday as I was learning this, if it's even possible for the human mind to hold so many things in our little brains. But I found some kind of a trick. But it took about 2 hours to find the trick. Hakopanim. We started with tying a harp string. So, if you're in the Beis HaMikdash and you're a Levi and your harp string breaks, so the Chachamim say, so we had 3 ways to, so basically the Mishnah said you could tie the harp string. We had a Brisa that says you cannot, you can only use a bow. So we had 3 ways of understanding the machlokas. One is that the Chachamim say that that you could tie the string in a knot, and Reb Shimon says you can only tie it in a bow, because the Chachamim say that machshirei mitzvah are doche Shabbos, and Reb Shimon says machshirei mitzvah are not doche Shabbos. The second way to understand the machlokas is that the Chachamim say, well, that they're both brises are the Mishnah and the brise of the Chachamim, and it just depends where the knot breaks. If it breaks at the end of the string, so then you would tie it in a bow. If it breaks in the middle of the string, so then it needs more support, so you have to tie it in a knot. The third way to understand it is going back to the machlokas between Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, but this time we're saying that they both agree that machshirei mitzvah are doche Shabbos, and that the string breaks in the middle in the middle. The Chachamim say that you can tie it in a proper knot, whereas Reb Shimon says that out of concern of when it breaks at the end, that you only tie it in a bow. Even when it breaks in the middle, you tie it in a bow. Okay. Removing warts from Korbans. So this is where there's a lot of moving pieces. So we had a machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. Just to make things more complicated, we don't actually know whose opinion is which, so it's not like we even have a name to anchor it on. But we said that according to one opinion, that if the wart is dry, so then you could remove it however you want, whether bechli, whether biyad. If the wart is moist, so then you'd be allowed to remove it with your hand, but you would not be allowed to remove it with a kli. Okay. The other way to understand it is that, forget about the distinction about dry versus moist. It's that if you're using a kli, so then you cannot remove it whether it's dry, whether it's moist. You can't use it. But if you're using your hand, well then, if it's at that point, if it is dry, so then you can remove it. If it's moist, so then you cannot remove it. Okay. Then we get to the opinion of Rav Yosef, who says that if the wart is dry, then you can remove it however you want. If the wart is moist, so then you would only be allowed to remove it with your hand, but it would have to be in the Beis HaMikdash. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you'd be unable to remove it. Okay? Rava says, just like Rav Yosef, that if the wart is dry, you can remove it, and that you are unable to remove it with a moist wart with a kli. It has to be with your hand. And this is Rabbi Eliezer, who says that machshir mitzvah are doche Shabbos. Yet, if you can make some kind of a shinoi, you should, and therefore that is why you shouldn't use a kli, even though technically you can, because machshir mitzvah docha Shabbos. Then at the end we talk about dressing a finger cut in the Beis HaMikdash. So if it's with a reed, the Mishnah says that you're allowed to use a reed. If it's with a small belt, well then Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chiya says it's not allowed because it will be considered adding garments, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says it's permitted because you don't have to worry about adding garments of that size on your hand, where you don't have any garments to wear. Peace.